Greetings, sibingelele futhi ngelihle igama lika Jesu Christ inkosi nomsindisi, Nkosi yamakhosi, King of Kings, Lords of Lords. There is only one God who has revealed himself in Christ. This God is one. In essence, three in persons. We are grateful for your support and for coming to view the channel again. Thank you very much. We want to do just a short video on a very controversial issue. It's not supposed to be controversial, you know. It's an easy issue. You know, if people like decide to think you know, about it from, you know, correct, you know, from correct perspective, correct context. There's a guy in South Africa, Penuel the Black Pen, Penuel Mlotshwa. You can search him. He has a huge platform. He has a podcast. It's very influential, especially among the young South African men, and many people do know him. You know, he often brings people who are people with, you know, big names, you know, in the South African society, and he's a very smart guy, very smart, and he has done, you know, so much. I think he has 7 children, still young, 7 children, I think with 4 different baby mamas. None of them like is married to him, but often he has some, you know, important and very good lessons on, you know, economics and politics, and sometimes he does want to talk about issues of history, theology, and culture. And that's where I think, you know, the latter three, I think like he is most of the time he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he does not have the correct views, you know, regarding these issues. So in one of the posts that he made, and you know, he has videos on this where he talks about these things. There's a post that he made. He said, "Stop paying amalobola for Christian women, except for a few biblical cases. Paying dowry is not a requirement in Christianity. Women who claim to be both Christians and cultural are sinning." Let me repeat that. Women who claim to be both Christian and cultural are sinning. Slaughtering animals for ancestors and speaking via ancestors to God is not allowed. You see, so this guy, Christians are not supposed to take lobola. You know, even though he's wrong, you know, in that sense, but there's also something that is funny, you know, within the Christian church, and people, you know, unbelievers do, you know, take note of it, and they like to expose Christians about it. That, you know, Christians hate everything, you know, that is to hate about, you know, native culture, except for lobola. You know, and they are right. You know, many Christians, especially within the charismatic movement, the Reformed movement, and all this type of, you know, churches, they bash and talk bad about, you know, African native culture, you know, and but at the end of the day, there are those which they do not want to associate themselves with. But that's one of lobola. They seem to not want to let go. They seem to not want to let go. They want these cows. They want this money, you know. So they don't want to let this type of practice to let go. And this guy is pointing something that this is not a requirement, you know, biblically speaking. He says it's not a requirement. And you know, this whole issue of lobola has become, you know, a very toxic practice, if you can ask me. It has become a very toxic, very, very, very toxic practice. And the way that it exists right now, I think it ought to be abolished. It's unnecessary. And just because we do desire it to be abolished, it doesn't mean then we have to accept, Western cultural practices such as, white wedding, having to do a white wedding and having to go to church where you exchange rings and vows and, all those type of things, that were imposed by the Westerners on us. They are not required. There are some people who even believe that, if your wedding is not done, via white wedding and going to the church where you will have the pastor, exchanging rings and all of this type. If your wedding is not like that, therefore it's not a Christian wedding. There are people who do believe that. But now, addressing the issue of ilobola, which Penuel points here, that we Christian women, people should stop paying ilobola for Christian women. First of all, let us make it clear. A Christian woman is not supposed to be in any relationship with a non-Christian man. Let's start there. But even with that, Christianity always exists within a culture. Christianity always exists within a culture. People have to understand that. And for the most part, it doesn't mean that just because you are a Christian, therefore you have to throw away your culture. That's just absurd, and it's not promoted by the Bible. Paul speaks of the fact, that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 to 22, we do have a sermon where we do talk about this on African Christian identity. If you can check in our YouTube, we do have a sermon. Paul speaks there that to the Jews he becomes like a Jew, so that he can win the Jew. To those without the law, he becomes as if he is one without the law, so that he can win them to Christ. To those not having the law, I become like those, to the weak, I became as one who is weak. So that, like, what is Paul saying here? Paul here is talking about the issue of contextualization. Paul was a Jew, you see, but he was a Christian, he was a Jew. Christianity gives you that flexibility. So when he comes to the Jews, he lives like a Jew. He lives like a Jew. And Jews with their culture, the ceremonial laws, all those type of things. Paul will come there and then, behave like them. He will take their culture, behave like them, so that he can reach them for Christ, so that he can preach the gospel to them. He is not just, going there to just enjoy whatever they are doing. But now when he succeeds and some turn to Christ, he doesn't just tell them that now, okay, you have to stop all your cultural practices. He doesn't. There's not even one single biblical verse which tells people that, there's not even one single biblical verse that tells people that since you're now a Christian, you have to throw away your cultural practices. People who are saying that stuff, people who have never read the Bible and they have a wicked, evil agenda. Don't listen to them. And then, to those without the law, those are the Gentiles, he comes to them and live as though he's one without the law. And then he gives a qualifier, which is even though he lives among those without the law, but he doesn't forget that he's under the law of Christ. So that means at the end of the day, this is not a free-for-all. Culturally, he will come and live like the Gentiles and reach them with the gospel. You see, that's what Paul is saying there. He will reach them for the gospel. To the weak, he does the same. So the idea of Penuel then saying, people should stop paying amalobolo for Christian women. It's flawed. This shows a person who doesn't really understand how Christianity works. Because within our culture, the practice of lobola is there. The practice of paying lobola for a woman exists. You see, and then he says, except for a few biblical cases, paying dowry is not a requirement in Christianity. Yes, maybe a father of a Christian lady can decide and say, no, maybe you are coming to marry her daughter, his daughter, and then the father decides that, don't worry about lobola, don't pay lobola, and it's fine. A father can decide that. But if he also decides that no, he wants lobola to be paid, you will then have to pay lobola. You see, you will then have to pay lobola, because culturally it is required, and God respects culture, because cultures are born out of the sovereign plan of God. Cultures, they point to the sovereignty of God. And yes, there are problems in our culture, and the gospel is able to fix those things. The Bible doesn't teach us to obliterate, our cultures and our identities. Such is just absurd. And then he says, women who claim to be both Christian and cultural are sinning. This is a person who has never read the Bible, Every person in the entire Bible, in the Old Testament, Jews were cultural. In the New Testament, people such as your Peter, James, and those were Christians, and they were cultural. They never abandoned their Jewish identity. Including Paul. Paul was completely aware that he was a Jew. You see, Christ, when he was on this planet, did all that was wanted and demanded, by Jewish laws, Jewish tradition, the Torah. He did all that was required of him. He went into the temple. He was circumcised when he was young. He did all that which was required of him. So did the apostles. So then to claim that, women who claim to be both Christian and culturally are sinning. This is a guy who literally doesn't understand much of Christianity, and I think to a large extent is influenced by this Eurocentric type of thinking, which was seeking to remove people off their terms so that they can put them in these European terms and therefore exploit them for European advantage. Slaughtering animals for ancestors and speaking via ancestors to God is not allowed. First of all, even back then, with the issue of lobola, and with some of the issues that we have with izangoma and slaughtering to the dead, you will then have to go and read about a man who was called Theophilus Shamtin. He was a British employee who spent so much time in KZN. What this guy did, the current lobola views that we have, which sort of like standardization, where maybe in KZN for a virgin you have to take 10 cows, sometimes it's 7, that type of standardization, comes from this man, Theophilus Shamtin. He's the guy who is responsible for this toxic lobola environment. Prior to him, within the native society, lobola was a flexible thing. You lobolad the girl that you want with those things which were important in the community. They can be cows, they can be goats, they can be some agricultural produce, or some metal objects, jewelry, all those type of things, or others will even go to the woman's family and spend, I think, 2 years, 3 years hunting for the family and doing all those type of stuff, and then the person will be given a wife. We do see this even with Jacob, in the Old Testament. So lobola was flexible. There was that standardization did not exist. Right now, it's either it's cows or it's money. In fact, if you do not have the 10 cows or the 7 cows that they want, so they will charge you money based on the value of those cows. So it has been standardized. In some times, like, the man will be required to come and build a house for the woman's family, and the family would then take that as a lobola, a payment of lobola. So it did not have this type of poison that we see right now today. And the person who was deeply influential in creating that toxic environment, which has created this mess that we see, was the British colonialist Theophilus Shelton, who was called Somtseu in the KZN. He spent time in the Cape Colony, and he also spent time in KZN. He was responsible for the annexation of Transvaal. He even fought, he was also anti-Boers. He did not even like the Boers, because the British at that time did not like the Boers. So this is the man, this is the toxic man, this is the evil man who has created this mess that we see right now. Lobola is supposed to be a flexible thing. People are not supposed to be exploited. It's not for your family to get rich. Lobola is not for your family to get rich, you see. And a man is not required to pay the whole full price. We even have a saying, I think, in where we come from, ukuthi umfazi akaqedwa. That means you will pay ilobola for the rest of your life. I think that practice is much better, even though I don't like the fact that they will make a higher price and then expect you to pay it for the rest of your life. But you can pay a little bit, but living with your wife, still fine. You're not required to pay everything. If the family decides that, okay, with what you have came with, then we accept that and we give you our daughter. Once the family of the woman agrees with that, therefore God honors that, and also the requirements of the law of the land are fulfilled. Therefore God honors that. That's marriage. God honors it. Doesn't have to be a white wedding where you have to go and make a huge celebration at church and all this type of stuff. People might like to impose those things as if, like, these are the requirements. No, if the family say yes and the requirements, in the regarding the law of the lands are fulfilled, therefore everything is fine. So it doesn't have to be toxic. Lobola doesn't have to be toxic. You even have elders today